The Nile Delta, circa 3000 BCE. A man named Khenti, though we do not know his name. Only what men like him did stood in the shallow marshes of what would later be called Wadi Natrun, under a sun so fierce it could crack the earth. His linen wrapped around his waist was damp with sweat and something else. A white powder that clung to his skin like a second layer, stinging at every small cut and abrasion. This man was not digging for gold or jewels. He was harvesting crystals of natron, a substance so ordinary in appearance and so profound in consequence that it would fundamentally reshape human civilization. Khenti did not know he was participating in a revolution. He knew only that he was hungry, that his family depended on what he gathered from these marshes, and that the white crystals seemed to possess an almost magical property. When the flooding came, and on the Nile, it always came, Khenti would watch salt preserve the fish that would otherwise rot in the heat. When hunters brought meat from the desert, salt kept it from spoiling. In a world without refrigeration, without modern chemistry, without any understanding of microbiology, salt was nothing less than a key to survival. But here is where Khenti's story becomes something greater than the tale of a salt worker. What he did not understand, what could not yet be known, was that by harvesting these crystals, he was enabling something that would change the course of human history. Salt would allow food to travel. Food that traveled meant people could gather in larger numbers. People gathered in larger numbers meant cities could form. Cities meant civilization. The ancient Egyptians, Khenti's people, believed that natron was divine. They called it Nedri, the name meaning divine salt or God's salt. This was not mere mysticism. They observed something remarkable. When they packed the bodies of their dead in natron, something sacred seemed to occur. The flesh would not rot. The body would be preserved, not for days or weeks, but for centuries. To a people who believed in an afterlife, who believed that the physical form mattered for the journey to the eternal realm, this was nothing short of a miracle. And it all hinged on salt. Khenti could not have known that 3,000 years after his death, archaeologists would unearth mummies perfectly preserved by his humble work. He could not have known that empires would rise and fall on the control of salt deposits. He could not have known that wars would be fought. Revolutions sparked, and the fate of nations decided by taxation on the very crystals he collected by hand. Yet, in the most profound way, Khenti did know. Every culture that encounters salt learns the same lesson. This substance is not optional. It is not a luxury item or a decorative spice. It is fundamental. The human body cannot function without salt. The preservation of food depends on salt. The very concept of food security and therefore social stability is built upon salt. This is the secret that Khenti's labor revealed, a secret that would echo through millennia. This is the story of salt, how a simple mineral became the foundation of empires, sparked revolutions, shaped trade routes across continents, and transformed the way humans could live together. It is a story of power, economics, desperation, and ingenuity. It is the story of how something found in abundance in nature became scarce through geography, and how that scarcity became wealth. It is a story written in crystals, in trade contracts, in tax records, in the blood of soldiers, and in the determination of people fighting for freedom. To understand salt is to understand civilization itself. This is where that story begins. Section 2. Ancient Egypt, the Divine Salt. The Nile Delta in the second half of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era was a land of transformation. Each year, the river would rise and flood the valley, depositing rich black soil that made agriculture possible. Each year, when the floods receded, the people of Egypt would harvest their crops. And each year, the same fundamental problem would return. How do you keep food from spoiling in a climate where heat is relentless and decay is inevitable? The answer lay north and east of the Nile, in a series of salt lakes and marshes that stretched across the desert. The ancient Egyptians called this region Wadi Natrun, the Valley of Natron. Here, in what is today a remote area of the western desert, natural deposits of natron emerged from evaporated lake beds. Natron is a form of sodium carbonate decahydrate, a mineral that occurs naturally when salt water evaporates in arid climates. The Egyptians did not know its chemical composition, but they knew its properties with intimate precision. Natron possesses a remarkable quality. It is a natural desiccant. When organic matter comes into contact with natron, the mineral draws moisture from the flesh like a sponge drawing water. This process is not quick decay masked by salt. This is true preservation. Bacteria and fungi cannot thrive in an environment stripped of moisture. Flesh treated with natron does not rot, it mummifies. The ancient Egyptians, observing this phenomenon, concluded that natron possessed divine properties. And in a sense, they were correct not in a supernatural way, but in the simple fact that it preserved what should have perished. The religious significance of salt in ancient Egypt cannot be overstated. The process of mummification became central to Egyptian civilization, and natron became central to mummification. The journey took approximately 40 to 70 days. First, the body would be placed in a natron bath, the salt working to extract moisture from the internal organs and skin. The natron would be changed periodically, each time drawing more life, or rather, moisture, from the corpse. The organs would shrivel. The skin would become dark and leathery. The hair would persist. The teeth would remain fixed in place, and the general form of the person would be preserved in a state that seemed almost eternal. By the time of the Old Kingdom, roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE, mummification had become not merely a practice, but a defining religious obligation. The wealthy could afford extensive mummification. The poor would have simpler burials. But the practice itself became foundational to Egyptian religion and social structure. And at the center of this practice stood salt. The Wadi Natron deposits were not unlimited. This created the first true salt economy in human history. Control over the natron deposits meant wealth. Access to natron meant the ability to participate in the religious rituals that Egyptians believed were necessary for the afterlife. And therefore, control over salt deposits became control over salvation itself, at least in the minds of a deeply religious people. The Egyptian state understood this power and regulated access to the natron mines accordingly. But the story of salt in ancient Egypt extends far beyond mummification. If mummification was salt's spiritual role, then food preservation was its practical role, and perhaps the more important one for the survival of civilization. Egypt, despite the bounty of the Nile, was not immune to the fundamental problem of food security. The river valley produced grain abundantly. It produced fish abundantly, but grain could be eaten by insects and rodents. Fish would rot in the heat. Meat from hunted animals would spoil within days. In a world without any technology for refrigeration, food was a wasting asset. Today's meal could not simply be stored for tomorrow unless something was done to prevent decay. Salt solved this problem. Egyptian fishermen and hunters learned that by preserving their catch in salt, whether using the natron from Wadi Natron or sea salt harvested from the Mediterranean and Red Sea coasts, they could extend the life of their food indefinitely. A fish salted 1 month could be eaten 3 months later. Meat could be preserved through seasons. This meant that times of abundance could be stored against times of scarcity. This meant that a family did not need to catch fish or hunt meat every single day to survive. They could catch a surplus, preserve it, and draw upon that surplus as needed. The implications of this simple technology were revolutionary. Preserved food meant food security. Food security meant populations could grow. It meant people could specialize some fishing, some farming, some doing other work entirely. It meant that cities could form. A city cannot exist if the majority of people must spend their entire day hunting for immediate survival. But a city can exist if food can be preserved, stored, and distributed. Salt made cities possible. The ancient Egyptians harvested salt from 4 major sources. First, there was Wadi Natron, the valley that gave the substance its name and reputation. This was the most abundant source and the most valued, particularly for religious and mummification purposes. Second, there were the salt lakes of the Nile Delta itself, lakes that formed as the river flowed to the Mediterranean. Third, there was the Red Sea coast, where salt could be harvested by evaporating seawater. Fourth, there was the Mediterranean coast to the north. The Egyptian state recognized the value of these deposits and moved to control them. The pharaoh, as the living god and representative of divine authority on earth, claimed ownership of all major salt deposits. Individuals could harvest salt, but only with permission, and often only through paying a portion of their harvest to the state. This created a system where the central government could derive revenue from salt without actually having to do the harvesting themselves. It was an elegant form of taxation, probably the earliest form of systematic taxation in human history. Salt revenue contributed significantly to the wealth of the Egyptian state. This wealth allowed for the construction of monuments, the maintenance of the military, the bureaucracy that held the empire together. In a very real sense, the pyramids were built partially with stone, partially with labor, but partially also with salt. The grain that fed the workers was preserved with salt. The state that organized the workers drew revenue from salt. The connection is not direct, but it is undeniable. The ancient Egyptians also discovered another use for salt that would prove significant: the creation of blue pigment. Egyptian blue, one of the most remarkable pigments of the ancient world, was created through a process involving natron and copper compounds. This blue pigment would be used in paints, in glazes for ceramics, and in the creation of faience, a glazed ceramic substance that was highly valued in ancient Egypt. The brilliant blue of Egyptian faience ware, found in tombs and temples across Egypt, was possible because of natron. This pigment became so characteristic of Egyptian art that it defined the aesthetic of an entire civilization. Based on what we know of Egyptian economic records and administrative documents, it becomes clear that salt was treated with the same seriousness that later civilizations would treat gold or silver. The record-keeping around salt harvesting, salt distribution, and salt taxation was meticulous. The state employed officials specifically to oversee salt operations. This level of bureaucratic attention reveals how central salt was to the functioning of Egyptian society. The ancient Egyptians understood something that would take many other civilizations centuries to learn. Control the salt, and you control the food supply. Control the food supply, and you control the people. This was not tyranny in the modern sense. The pharaoh was not trying to starve the population into submission. Rather, it was a simple recognition of economic reality. Salt was essential, and therefore whoever controlled salt held significant power. As Egyptian civilization flourished along the Nile, as its power extended up the river and across the Mediterranean, as its influence shaped the ancient world, salt remained at the foundation of all of it. The preserved fish that fed the armies, the mummified bodies that sustained the religious system, the salt revenue that paid for administration and monuments. All of it flowed from the white crystals harvested in Wadi Natron and along the coasts of Egypt. By the time Egyptian civilization had reached its height, perhaps around 1500 BCE, during the reign of the New Kingdom pharaoh, salt had become thoroughly woven into the fabric of Egyptian life. It was religious, economic, and practical all at once. It was so essential that its value seemed almost self-evident. In this way, Egypt was not unique. Every civilization that would follow would learn the same lesson. Salt was not a luxury. Salt was life itself. Section 3. Mesopotamia and the Classical World. While Egyptian civilization was discovering the properties of natron in the salt lakes of the delta, another great civilization was emerging in the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, would develop differently from Egypt in many ways. But in one crucial aspect, it would reach identical conclusions. Salt was essential. The earliest written records of salt harvesting come from Mesopotamia. In cuneiform tablets, dating to around 3000 BCE, approximately the same period when Kenti was gathering natron in Egypt, Mesopotamian scribes were recording the production and distribution of salt. These are among the oldest written records of any economic activity. The fact that salt merited written documentation so early reveals how important it was to these ancient peoples. The Mesopotamians obtained salt from several sources. The region near the Persian Gulf had salt deposits. The Euphrates River, though not as dramatic as the Nile, would deposit salt in certain areas as it flowed. There were salt lakes and marshes. But unlike Egypt, Mesopotamia did not have easy access to enormous, concentrated deposits of natron. This meant that the Mesopotamian approach to salt was somewhat different, less dependent on one resource, more reliant on trade. The economic records that survive show that salt in Mesopotamia was used for all the same purposes as in Egypt: preservation of fish and meat, trade in preserved goods, and religious practices. The Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians all understood salt's value. And like the Egyptians, they began to regulate it. Salt production came under state control. Salaries for workers were sometimes paid in salt or in goods purchased with salt revenue. The state taxed salt, deriving a significant portion of its revenue from this mineral. It is worth noting here that the common phrase "salt for a salary," often explained as deriving from Roman soldiers being paid in salt, is likely a modern misinterpretation. While salt was certainly valuable enough in the ancient world to be used as payment, or to have workers paid with goods purchased through salt revenue, the direct linguistic connection between salary and salt is disputed among historians. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, which may derive from sal, salt, but this etymology, while charming, is not definitively proven. What we can say with certainty is that salt was valuable enough that it was used in economic transactions and that the state controlled its distribution. As we move into the Greek period, around 800 BCE and onward, we see salt continuing to play a central role in Mediterranean civilization. The Greeks understood salt's properties and benefits. They preserved fish and meat in salt. They harvested salt from evaporating seawater, particularly around the Mediterranean and Aegean coasts. They traded salt as a commodity. Greek city-states built their economic power partly on trade in salted goods. The famous salt-preserved fish from the Black Sea region became a valuable trade commodity that flowed throughout the Mediterranean. But it is with Rome that salt truly became a matter of imperial strategy. The Romans, like all ancient peoples, needed salt. But the Romans approached salt with the same systematic thinking that they applied to law, architecture, and military strategy. Salt, they understood, was not merely a luxury or an economic convenience. Salt was fundamental to maintaining an empire. An army marches on its stomach, as the saying goes, and that stomach depends on preserved food. A soldier can carry salted meat and fish. Salted food does not spoil. An army without reliable food supply cannot operate. The Romans built their great military machine partly on the foundation of salted provisions. The legionaries who conquered and held together an empire did so sustained by food preserved with salt. This was not romantic or noble. It was practical. Salt made it possible to feed standing armies far from home, to maintain them in the field, and to support the logistics of conquest. Recognizing salt's strategic importance, the Roman state moved to ensure reliable salt supplies. This led to the creation of one of the ancient world's most famous infrastructure projects, the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, or more literally, the Road of Salt. The Via Salaria ran from the salt ponds of the central Italian coast inland to Rome and beyond. The exact route varied over time, but the basic function remained constant. It was the road along which salt traveled from the production areas to the capital and to the armies. The road began at salt marshes and lagoons along the Tyrrhenian Sea, particularly in the area of modern-day Ostia and the mouth of the Tiber River. From there, it ran northeast, following valleys and ancient paths that had been used for salt transport long before Rome was a major power. The Romans, however, did more than use the Via Salaria. They improved it. They paved portions of it. They stationed garrisons along it to ensure that salt transport was not disrupted by bandits or enemies. They fortified key points. In doing so, the Romans turned a salt trade route into a genuine road of empire, one that not only carried salt, but also connected Rome to its hinterland, facilitating the movement of troops, goods, and administrative authority. It is reasonable to infer that the importance of the Via Salaria to Roman military strategy cannot be overstated. Without reliable access to salt, the Roman military apparatus would have been unable to function at the scale it achieved. Without the roads and infrastructure that carried salt, Rome might not have become Rome. The Roman state, like its predecessors in Egypt and Mesopotamia, taxed salt production. Salt became a significant source of revenue for the imperial treasury. Taxes on salt were considered reliable because demand for salt was inelastic. People needed it, regardless of price. If taxes went up, people could not simply choose to forgo salt. They had to pay. This made salt an ideal target for taxation, and Roman administrators understood this principle well. The Romans also expanded salt production within their territory. They built more salt ponds. They improved techniques for extracting salt. They established salt monopolies in certain regions, where the state was the sole authorized producer or distributor of salt, capturing all the revenue. This economic system proved so effective that various regions of the Roman Empire would be called salt wealthy, or have their prosperity attributed partly to salt resources. As Roman civilization spread across the Mediterranean and beyond, salt infrastructure spread with it. Salaries were paid, tributes were collected, trade networks were established, all involving salt. The preserved food that sustained Roman armies as they conquered Britain in the north and Egypt in the south depended on salt. The stability of the empire, in ways both obvious and subtle, rested on access to this mineral. By the time of the late Roman Empire, around 300–400 CE, salt was so thoroughly embedded in the economic and military system of Rome that its loss would be catastrophic. Indeed, as the empire fragmented and central authority weakened, one of the things that happened was disruption of salt supply networks. This disruption made it harder to preserve food, which made it harder to feed armies and cities, which contributed to the larger collapse. This is not to say that salt was the cause of Rome's fall. That would be an oversimplification of extraordinary complexity. But it is to say that salt was woven through the entire fabric of Roman civilization, and disruption to salt supply had real consequences. The classical world, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, all reached the same conclusions about salt independently. Salt was essential. Salt deserved state control. Salt was worth fighting for and dying for. Salt was an engine of economics and military power. These lessons would persist through history. Every civilization that would follow would learn them anew, often through painful experience. And in many cases, the next great center of civilization would organize itself around salt in strikingly similar ways. Section 4. Medieval Europe and the Gabelle. In the centuries following the fragmentation of the Roman Empire, Europe entered what was sometimes called the Dark Ages. Much of the infrastructure of Rome fell into disrepair. Trade networks collapsed. Cities shrank. The centralized authority that had characterized the empire gave way to feudalism, a decentralized system of local lords and their dependent vassals. Yet salt remained essential. As always, food needed to be preserved. As always, the seasons brought cycles of abundance and scarcity. As always, salt was the answer to the problem of spoilage. But with the collapse of Roman infrastructure, salt became harder to get in many parts of Europe. The production of salt in medieval Europe centered on specific regions. Along the coasts, salt could be harvested by evaporating seawater. In inland areas, salt from underground deposits or salt springs could be mined or extracted. In the Atlantic regions of Europe, particularly in what is now Portugal, Spain, and France, salt production became significant. In some regions, salt was produced in sufficient quantities to become a trade commodity. In other regions, salt was scarce and therefore expensive. This scarcity led to significant variation in the value and taxation of salt across medieval Europe. In regions far from salt sources, salt was expensive. In regions near salt production, it was cheaper. This created opportunities for trade. Merchants could buy salt cheaply in one region and sell it for profit in another. And as merchants began to exploit these price differences, regional governments took notice. Most kingdoms and principalities in medieval Europe began to regulate salt production and trade. They did this for revenue purposes. By taxing salt, they could extract wealth from their subjects. But they also did it for control purposes. By regulating salt, they could control food preservation, and therefore food supply, and therefore population. Nowhere was this principle taken to a more extreme level than in France. In the medieval period, various regional authorities in France imposed taxes on salt. These were not systematic. Initially, different regions had different rules. But by the mid-14th century, this began to change. In 1341, King Philip VI of France established a national salt tax called the Gabelle. This was not the first salt tax in France. Earlier versions had existed, but this was the first attempt to make it systematic and national. The word Gabelle itself derives from an Arabic word for tax, reflecting the long history of salt taxation in regions that had been under Islamic rule or influence. Here is how the Gabelle worked. The king, through his agents, would establish control over salt production and distribution. Salt could not be freely produced or traded. Instead, the state would produce or purchase salt and then sell it to the population at a fixed price, which included a significant tax. Alternatively, the state would tax the salt that private producers made, collecting a percentage before it could be sold to consumers. The effect was profound and felt immediately. The price of salt in France rose dramatically. For poor people, and in the medieval period, most people were poor, this was a serious hardship. Salt was not a luxury item. It was necessary for food preservation. When the price of salt went up, the price of salted food went up. This affected everyone's diet and budget. To make matters worse, the Gabelle was not uniformly applied across France. Some regions had higher tax rates than others. Some regions were exempt. This created a patchwork of different salt prices across the kingdom, with some regions paying significantly more than neighboring regions for the same commodity. This unfairness bred resentment and conflict. The people of France had a name for those who fought against the salt tax. They were called faux sauniers, literally false salters, or salt smugglers. These were not criminals in the modern sense. They were ordinary people who viewed the salt tax as unjust and unfair. They would smuggle salt from low-tax regions to high-tax regions, or from outside France into France, avoiding the tax. They would buy salt in one region and sell it clandestinely in another. They were not glorified in official records, but in the popular imagination, they became folk heroes, people standing up against an unjust tax. The smuggling of salt became so widespread that the French state found it necessary to employ inspectors and agents, specifically to catch salt smugglers. These agents were given significant authority and could conduct searches, seize contraband, and arrest suspects. Yet despite this enforcement, smuggling continued. The profit margin on salt was simply too high for the smuggling trade to be suppressed entirely. The smuggling of salt became so widespread that the French state found it necessary to employ inspectors and agents, specifically to catch salt smugglers. These agents were given significant authority and could conduct searches, seize contraband, and arrest suspects. Yet despite this enforcement, smuggling continued. The profit margin on salt was simply too high for the smuggling trade to be suppressed entirely. It is important to understand that this was not merely a matter of individual greed or criminality. The Gabelle was genuinely unpopular because it was genuinely unjust. The same salt that cost pennies in one region cost many times more in another. The same salt that was free to produce and harvest was taxed at such a rate that ordinary people had to make do with less. There was real social anger at the Gabelle. This social anger persisted for centuries. The Gabelle remained in place, with variations, throughout the medieval period and into the early modern era. It became one of the symbols of royal excess and injustice. In the years leading up to the French Revolution, that cataclysmic event that would reshape not just France, but the entire world, the Gabelle featured prominently in lists of grievances. The salt tax was not the cause of the revolution, but it was certainly one of the many expressions of popular anger that contributed to it. In 1790, in the early fervor of the revolution, the Gabelle was abolished. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen did not specifically mention salt, but the spirit of that declaration that all people should be treated equally, that unjust taxes should be eliminated, led directly to the elimination of the Gabelle. For the first time in nearly 450 years, the French people could buy salt without paying a special tax. The victory was not permanent. After the revolution, after the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, the Gabelle was reinstated in 1815, though at lower rates than before. It would persist in various forms until 1945, when it was finally abolished for good. But its presence throughout those centuries remains a testament to both the value of salt and the anger that unjust taxation could generate. The Gabelle also reveals an important principle: whoever controls salt can extract significant wealth. Medieval rulers understood this. They could impose a tax on salt and know that people would pay, because people could not live without salt. This is an inelastic demand that does not decrease significantly when prices rise. In the modern economy, most goods are elastic. If the price of oranges goes up, people buy fewer oranges. But salt is different. If the price of salt goes up, people do not simply buy less salt and accept rotting food. They pay the higher price, or they find ways to evade the tax. This principle was not lost on other European rulers. Many kingdoms and principalities in Europe developed their own salt taxes, though usually not to the extent of the French Gabelle. The salt monopolies enriched merchants and governments alike. Control over salt became a form of wealth and power. The medieval period also saw the emergence of salt-based trade networks. Ports that specialized in salt production and trade grew rich. Venice, with its access to Mediterranean salt production, became wealthy partly through salt trade. The Hanseatic League, a confederation of merchant guilds in Northern Europe, controlled much of the salt trade in the Baltic and North Sea regions. These trading networks would lay the foundation for the mercantilism of the early modern period. In this way, the medieval period represents a kind of transition. The Roman infrastructure of salt roads and large-scale distribution had largely disappeared. But the essential value of salt remained. And as medieval rulers sought to consolidate power and extract revenue, they discovered what earlier rulers had known. Salt taxation was reliable, salt control was powerful, and salt trade was profitable. By the end of the medieval period, salt taxation and trade had become so embedded in European economics that it would shape the development of capitalism and the nation-state that would follow. Section 5. West Africa Salt and Gold Caravans. While medieval Europe was developing its salt taxes and salt trade networks, another part of the world was experiencing a transformative period involving salt. In West Africa, in the vast expanse of the Sahara Desert and the fertile lands to its south, a series of empires were rising to prominence. And at the center of their power and wealth was trade. And at the center of that trade were two commodities, gold and salt. The history of West African kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai is intimately connected with salt in ways that European rulers would have recognized immediately. Like their counterparts across the world, West African rulers discovered that control of salt was control of wealth. Ghana, the first of the great West African empires, emerged around 300 CE and reached its height around 1000 CE. At the center of Ghana's power was a trade network that moved across the Sahara Desert. South of the Sahara lay gold in abundance. The gold fields of West Africa were among the richest in the world. But gold, by itself, was valuable only if there was someone to trade it to. North of the Sahara lay the Islamic world, which desired gold intensely. But to reach those markets, merchants had to cross the Sahara. The Sahara is one of the most hostile environments on Earth. It is a vast expanse of sand and rock, where water is scarce and temperatures soar. Crossing it requires supplies, water, food, direction. But there is one more thing that is essential in this environment: salt. In a desert environment, the human body loses salt through sweat. Without salt replenishment, a person crossing the desert will eventually become unable to function. They will experience salt depletion, weakness, confusion, and ultimately, death. This biological reality created an economic opportunity. In the Sahara itself, in the midst of the desert, there are salt deposits. The most famous of these were the salt mines of Taghaza, and later Taudeni. These were not merely deposits of salt, they were sources of enormous quantities of it. Based on what we know, we can infer that these mines were worked systematically, with salt being extracted and transported. Here is where the genius of West African traders becomes apparent. They recognized that salt, which could be extracted in the Sahara, had two values: one as a necessity for crossing the desert, and another as a commodity for trade. Gold could be obtained south of the Sahara. Salt could be obtained in the Sahara. By controlling both of these, a trader could create a complete trade network. The Mali Empire, which succeeded Ghana in the medieval period, roughly 1241,645 CE, exemplified this understanding. Mali's power was based on three things: control of gold production in the south, control of salt mines in the Sahara, and control of the trade routes connecting them. Timbuktu, the famous city of Mali, became wealthy as a center of this trade network. Merchants from across West Africa and the Islamic world converged on Timbuktu. They came for gold, but they also came for salt. The exchange rate between salt and gold in medieval Mali was extraordinary. In the regions south of the Sahara, salt was scarce and therefore extremely valuable. In Timbuktu and other Mali trade centers, salt was sometimes exchanged for gold at rates approaching weight for weight. A pound of salt might trade for a pound of gold. In some cases, salt was worth even more than gold by weight. This seems almost impossible to modern ears. Salt, which we think of as cheap and abundant, worth as much as gold. But in the context of medieval West Africa, it makes perfect sense. The scarcity created by distance, difficulty of transport, and biological need created value that transcended the material properties of the substance. This could imply that the salt miners of Taghaza and Taudeni, though they worked in harsh conditions, were engaged in one of the most profitable economic activities of their time. The conditions in these mines were brutal, with much of the labor performed by enslaved people and those forced into servitude. But the wealth generated by salt mining was extraordinary. The trans-Saharan trade that was built around salt and gold shaped the entire region. Caravans, sometimes numbering thousands of camels, would travel across the Sahara carrying salt north to the Islamic world and gold south through Timbuktu and Mali. These caravans required organization, protection, and coordination. Kings and merchants who could organize these caravans became wealthy and powerful. The trade network itself became the foundation of empire. Cities grew up along the trade routes. Timbuktu, Gao, Dijen, and others became centers of wealth, learning, and culture. Universities and libraries flourished. The salt and gold trade generated enough wealth that rulers could support scholars, poets, and artisans. The famous manuscripts of Timbuktu, some of which survive to this day, were written by people supported by wealth generated by trade. The Songhai Empire, which succeeded Mali, roughly 1431,591 CE, continued this pattern. Songhai's power was based on the same economic foundation: control of gold in the south and salt in the Sahara. The empire's armies and administrators were supported by wealth generated by salt and gold trade. It is significant to note that the trans-Saharan salt trade persisted for centuries, from at least the 7th century CE through the 19th century. This was not a brief phenomenon, but a foundational economic system that shaped an entire region for over 1,000 years. The wealth generated by salt trade was comparable to the wealth generated by salt trade in medieval Europe, or the salt monopolies of China. The decline of the West African empires, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, came about through a complex series of factors: invasion, internal conflict, economic shifts. But as European interest in African gold shifted focus, the importance of the trans-Saharan trade routes began to decline. Eventually, European traders approaching by sea would change the dynamic entirely. But for over a millennium, salt was the foundation of West African power and prosperity. The West African salt trade reveals a universal principle: salt trade generates wealth and power. This principle held true in ancient Egypt, in Rome, in medieval France, in China, and in West Africa. Wherever salt could be controlled and traded, power followed. The specific details varied. The salt sources were different. The trade routes were different. The cultural contexts were different. But the fundamental economic and political reality remained the same. Section 6. China's ancient monopoly, 2,600 years of state control. If West Africa demonstrates the principle that salt generates power, then China demonstrates it on perhaps the most spectacular scale. For over 2,600 years, China maintained a state monopoly on salt. For centuries of that period, salt was the single largest source of government revenue. In some dynasties, salt taxation provided more income to the imperial treasury than all other taxes combined. No other nation has maintained control of salt for so long or extracted such profound economic benefit from it. The history of salt in China extends back into legend and mythology. Chinese mythology credits the Yellow Emperor, a legendary ruler from roughly 4,700 years ago, with the discovery of salt production. Whether or not this is historically accurate, it reflects the deep cultural significance of salt in Chinese civilization. The discovery of salt is attributed not to a merchant or a common person, but to the greatest and most divine figure in Chinese legend. This tells us that salt was not treated as a mere commodity, but as something essential to civilization itself. What we know historically is that salt production in China is documented at least as far back as the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE. In ancient China, salt was produced through boiling salt water in evaporation pans, a technique that would persist for thousands of years. It was also mined from underground deposits in certain regions. But the truly transformative moment came during the Han Dynasty, around 110 BCE. Emperor Wu of Han, seeking additional revenue to finance his military campaigns and the expansion of empire, made a crucial decision. He would place salt production under state monopoly. From that point forward, salt could not be freely produced by individuals. Instead, the state would produce salt and sell it to the population. All profit went to the government. This was not merely a tax on salt production, though it was that. It was a complete takeover of the salt economy. Private salt production was forbidden. Anyone caught producing salt illegally could face severe punishment. The state became the sole legal source of salt in China. The brilliance of this system, from an administrative perspective, was that it generated enormous revenue while appearing fair. Everyone needed salt. Everyone had to buy it from the state at the state's set price. No one could argue that the system was unjust to a particular group. It applied equally to all. And yet the revenue stream was vast and reliable. During the Han Dynasty, salt revenue contributed roughly 30–40% of the imperial government's total income. This was extraordinary. It meant that 1/3 to 2/5 of everything the government spent was paid for by salt monopoly profits. The military campaigns that expanded China, the bureaucracy that administered it, the public works that built infrastructure, all of this was substantially funded by salt. As the Han Dynasty gave way to subsequent dynasties, the salt monopoly persisted. Different rulers modified it in different ways, but the fundamental principle remained: salt was a state monopoly, and it was the government's primary source of revenue. It is important to understand why China's salt monopoly was so effective and so enduring. Part of the reason was geography. China had enormous salt deposits. Along the eastern coast, seawater could be evaporated for salt. In various inland locations, there were salt mines and salt springs. China's territory was large enough and diverse enough that salt could be produced in multiple locations, making it difficult for anyone to challenge the state's monopoly through controlling a particular region. But there was another factor: bureaucratic sophistication. China developed one of the world's most advanced bureaucratic systems. The imperial government had the administrative capacity to implement and enforce a monopoly across vast territories and multiple centuries. Tax collectors could be stationed throughout the realm. Records could be kept. Smugglers could be pursued. The infrastructure of enforcement existed in a way that it did not in many other parts of the world. By the Tang Dynasty, which ruled from 618 to 907 CE, the salt monopoly had become even more sophisticated and more profitable. Historical records indicate that during the Tang Dynasty, salt revenue exceeded 50% of total government income in some periods. This was the peak of salt's economic importance to China. The Tang Dynasty built temples, supported scholars, maintained a vast military, and administered an enormous empire substantially funded by salt. The Tang Dynasty also saw significant innovations in salt production. In the Sichuan region, there were underground brine deposits, salty water that occurred naturally beneath the earth. The Tang Dynasty developed the technology to drill deep wells to reach these brine deposits, extract the salt water, and boil it to produce salt. This technology was sophisticated for its time and increased the total salt production capacity of China. One particularly important figure in Tang Dynasty salt administration was Luan, who served in various administrative capacities from 716 to 780 CE. Lewin made significant reforms to the salt monopoly system. He restructured how salt was produced, distributed, and taxed. His reforms increased the efficiency of the system and dramatically increased revenue. Under Lewin's administration, salt tax revenue increased from approximately 400,000 strings of coins annually to more than 6 million strings of coins annually. This was a roughly 15-fold increase. This extraordinary increase was not simply a matter of collecting more money for nothing. Lewin's reforms involved improving the efficiency of salt production, reducing waste, and restructuring pricing to optimize revenue. His reforms represent early examples of what we might now call supply chain management and pricing optimization. Based on what we know of these reforms, we can infer that Lewin understood economic principles in a way that would not be systematized in the Western world for many centuries. The salt monopoly's prominence in the Chinese economy also created opportunities for corruption and smuggling. Because salt was so valuable, smuggling salt from state monopoly regions to regions where people were willing to pay premium prices for unmonopolized salt became profitable. Salt smuggling became endemic to Chinese society. To combat it, the state employed salt inspectors and maintained enforcement systems. This struggle between the state monopoly and salt smugglers had profound consequences at various points in Chinese history. It is reasonable to infer that some of the periodic rebellions and civil unrest in China was fueled at least partly by anger over the salt monopoly, and by the activities of salt smugglers and their sympathizers. Most notably, in 875 CE a major rebellion broke out in China, led by Huang Kao. Huang Kao was originally a salt merchant involved in the salt trade, and likely involved in salt smuggling. His rebellion grew to enormous proportions, involving perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, and nearly toppled the Tang dynasty. While the rebellion was motivated by many factors including general economic distress and political instability, the connection to salt and to smuggling suggests that salt monopoly policies contributed to social tension. The salt monopoly persisted through the Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties. Different dynasties modified it in different ways. Some periods saw greater enforcement and higher revenue. Other periods saw the monopoly weaken as central authority declined. But throughout this entire period, spanning more than 2,000 years from Emperor Wu of Han in 110 BCE through the fall of the Qing dynasty, in 1912, CE salt remained fundamentally under state control. Why did China maintain the salt monopoly for so long? The answer is simple: it worked. It generated enormous revenue. It was relatively easy to enforce, given China's bureaucratic sophistication. It was economically efficient. The state could produce and distribute salt at lower cost than private producers could, and capture the surplus as profit. And most importantly, it did not create the kind of social upheaval that might lead to its abolition, at least not in most periods. Yes, there was smuggling. Yes, there was some popular resentment. But for most periods of Chinese history, the salt monopoly was accepted as a normal and natural part of governance. It was not viewed with the same intense anger that the French Gabelle provoked. Part of this may be cultural Chinese political philosophy, generally accepted stronger central authority and state control of the economy than European philosophy did. Part of it may be that China's salt monopoly, while generating enormous revenue, did not create the extreme regional price disparities that the French Gabelle created. The salt monopoly in China represents the most sustained and successful example of state economic control in pre-modern history. It demonstrates that a state, if it has sufficient administrative capacity and cultural acceptance for its authority, can successfully monopolize a necessary commodity for centuries and profit enormously from doing so. It also demonstrates that such a system, while economically efficient from the state's perspective, can only persist if it does not generate excessive popular anger or prove administratively impossible to enforce. Section 7. Salt Wars and Political Upheaval. Throughout history, the control of salt has been worth fighting for. This was not always figurative. On multiple occasions, wars have been fought, at least in part, over salt and the trade routes that carried it. These salt wars reveal the profound strategic and economic importance of the commodity. One famous example involves Venice and Genoa, the two great maritime republics of the Mediterranean in the medieval period. Venice, positioned on the Adriatic coast with access to salt lagoons and marshes, controlled much of the salt trade in eastern Mediterranean. Genoa, positioned on the Ligurian coast with different salt sources, controlled much of the western Mediterranean salt trade. These two cities engaged in periodic conflicts for centuries, and while the wars were fought for many reasons, control of salt trade routes and salt production areas was consistently among them. Venice and Genoa fought 4 major wars between 1298 and 1380 CE, collectively called the Venetian-Genoese Wars. These wars involved massive naval battles, the destruction of fleets, and the deaths of tens of thousands. The wars were fought over dominance in Mediterranean trade, and salt trade was one of the significant commodities at stake. Control of the Adriatic Sea meant control of Adriatic salt. Control of the Western Mediterranean meant control of other salt sources. The victors could tax salt trade, regulate salt flows, and derive enormous revenue from salt commerce. In another example, salt smuggling and the desire to avoid salt taxation led to armed conflict. In France, as we noted, salt smugglers were common. In some regions, smugglers became organized enough to resist authorities by force. In 1548, there was a serious rebellion in southwest France against the Gabelle. This rebellion involved salt smuggling merchants and their sympathizers. While it was not solely about salt, the salt tax was a significant grievance. The rebellion had to be suppressed by royal troops. Salt taxation did not cause the rebellion, but it was part of the powder keg of resentment that exploded. In another region, salt taxation and control also sparked conflict. When the British East India Company took control of India in the late 18th century, one of the first things it did was establish a monopoly on salt, similar to salt monopolies that had existed in China and medieval Europe. The East India Company realized that India's coastline provided enormous quantities of seawater that could be evaporated for salt. By establishing a monopoly, the company could generate significant revenue. Later, when the British Crown took over direct control of India, after the 1857 rebellion, the salt monopoly continued. The British Crown maintained strict control of salt production. Indians were forbidden from producing salt. They could only buy salt from the government at state-controlled prices. The monopoly was profitable for the British, generating significant revenue to support colonial administration and military forces. The salt monopoly in India was particularly resented because it affected all Indians, regardless of wealth or status. Everyone needed salt. Everyone had to pay the British Crown for it. The monopoly came to symbolize colonial exploitation, a symbol of foreign power using control of a basic necessity to extract wealth from the population. This resentment would eventually explode into one of the most famous acts of civil disobedience in human history, Gandhi's Salt March. But before we reach that moment, it is worth understanding the economics that made salt taxation so attractive to colonial authorities. From a purely economic perspective, salt is an ideal target for taxation. Demand for salt is inelastic, meaning that the quantity demanded does not fall significantly when the price rises. People need salt for survival and for food preservation. They cannot simply choose to buy less salt and accept the consequences. If the government raises the salt tax, people will still buy salt, just perhaps in slightly smaller quantities. They will pay more in total because the price is higher. This makes salt taxation reliably profitable. This principle applies whether the government is medieval France or British-controlled India. As a taxation strategy, salt taxation is exceptionally effective. The state does not need to worry that people will refuse to buy salt or find alternative products. People have to buy. The money flows in. It is economically rational from the state's perspective. The problem, from a political perspective, is that this same inelasticity of demand makes salt. If I pay more for oranges because taxes went up, I might buy fewer oranges, it's my choice. But if I pay more for salt because taxes went up, I have no choice. I must pay, or I cannot preserve food, or I cannot stay healthy. This creates a sense of compulsion and injustice. Section 8. Gandhi's Salt March Revolution in a Crystal. In 1930, in India, an elderly man set out on a walk. His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, known to the world as Mahatma Gandhi, the Great Soul. His destination was a village called Dandi, approximately 240 miles away, on the coast of the Arabian Sea. His purpose was to commit an act of civil disobedience against the British colonial government. His method was to make salt from seawater. This sounds almost absurdly simple. A man walks to the sea and makes salt. How could this be revolutionary? And yet it was. The Salt March, as it came to be called, became one of the most famous acts of civil disobedience in history. It mobilized millions, challenged the authority of the British Empire, and contributed directly to Indian independence. To understand why salt was chosen as the focus of the independence movement, we must understand the context. India, in 1930, was ruled by the British Crown. The British had maintained a salt monopoly. Indians were not permitted to produce salt. They could only purchase it from the British government at state-controlled prices. This law, the Salt Act of 1882, had been in effect for nearly 50 years. The salt tax and monopoly affected every Indian. It increased the cost of salt for poor Indians who needed it for preservation and for health. It symbolized foreign control over Indian resources and Indian life. Every time an Indian bought salt, they were reminded that their most basic needs were controlled by a foreign power. Gandhi, who had been leading the Indian independence movement through various means for decades, came to a crucial realization: salt was the perfect focal point for mass resistance. Why? Because salt affected everyone. The untouchables, the poorest of India's poor, needed salt. The merchants needed salt. The farmers needed salt. Everyone could understand the injustice of a foreign government controlling salt. Everyone could participate in making salt. Moreover, the violation of the salt monopoly was an act that seemed minor enough that it might not provoke overwhelming military response, yet significant enough that it directly challenged British authority. If Gandhi simply encouraged Indian resistance to all British laws, the British might respond with overwhelming force. But making salt from seawater? How could the British respond to that without appearing absurdly oppressive? On March 12, 1930, Gandhi and approximately 78 followers began their march from Ahmedabad, India, toward the coast. They walked through villages and towns. As they walked, their numbers grew. Local people joined the march. The procession became larger and larger. People brought supplies. Journalists covered the march. News spread throughout India and around the world. The British authorities watched and waited. They were unsure how to respond. Arresting Gandhi immediately might provoke violence. On the other hand, allowing him to reach the sea and make salt would directly defy the salt monopoly. They chose to wait and see. On April 6, 1930, after 24 days of walking, Gandhi and his followers arrived at Dandi, a small village on the coast. The next day, April 6, Gandhi went to the beach, collected salt mud and salt water, and proceeded to make salt. In doing so, he violated the Salt Act. He had broken British law. This simple act, a man making salt from seawater, was the beginning of a mass movement. Across India, people followed Gandhi's example. They began making salt. Spontaneously, in villages and towns throughout the country, Indians began boiling seawater and collecting salt. They were not fighting with weapons. They were not attacking the government. They were simply making salt, a substance that existed in abundance in nature, that Indians had made for thousands of years before the British monopoly was established. The British response was swift and severe. They arrested Gandhi. They arrested the other leaders of the salt-making movement. But the arrests did not stop the movement. More people continued making salt. The British arrested more people. Within weeks, tens of thousands of Indians were in jail for the crime of making salt. The most dramatic moment came at Dharasana, a saltworks facility operated by the British. On May 21, 1930, several thousand Indian salt makers gathered at Dharasana to gather salt. British forces, including police and soldiers, were stationed there. The Indians gathered peacefully. They were not violent. They were not armed. But there were thousands of them, and they intended to collect salt. What happened next was recorded by journalists and observers. The British police attacked the Indian salt makers with clubs and lathis, sticks. They beat people who were standing peacefully. People fell. Blood was shed. Yet the Indians did not fight back. They did not attack the police. They simply endured the beating, and more people came forward to replace those who fell. The images of peaceful Indians being beaten by British police shocked the world. Newspapers around the globe covered the violence. The British, who had maintained their empire partly through the image of being a civilized power, looked barbaric. Public opinion began to turn against British rule in India. By the end of the Salt March campaign, over 60,000 Indians had been imprisoned for making salt. Many were beaten. Some were killed. But the movement persisted, and crucially, the image of the British brutally suppressing Indian salt makers spread around the world. International opinion shifted against the British. The salt monopoly, which had seemed like a reasonable source of colonial revenue, began to look like an intolerable act of oppression. The Salt March did not immediately end British rule in India, but it fundamentally changed the political dynamics. British authority in India was no longer unquestioned. Indian resistance was no longer fringe activism but mass movement. The events of 1930 set in motion the process that would lead to Indian independence in 1947. It is worth noting that the Salt March represents something profound: the use of civil disobedience, the deliberate violation of unjust law while accepting the legal consequences as a tool for social change. Gandhi had developed this philosophy over decades, but the Salt March was its most famous and most successful application. By choosing salt as the focal point, Gandhi chose an issue that every Indian understood and could participate in. Rich and poor, Hindu and Muslim, North and South, all could make salt. Furthermore, by making salt, Indians were not requesting permission or asking for the British to change their policy. They were unilaterally reclaiming their right to a basic resource that nature provided in abundance. The salt in the sea belonged to no one and everyone. The British monopoly, when exposed to this logic, appeared not just unjust, but almost absurd. How could anyone own the sea? How could anyone forbid people from using a naturally occurring resource? The Salt Act was never formally repealed, but after 1947, when India gained independence, the salt monopoly ended. Indians could make salt freely. Salt taxation continued in various forms. Most modern governments tax salt to some degree, but the colonial monopoly was gone. The Salt March demonstrates a crucial truth: Salt, for all its material simplicity, carries immense symbolic power. By focusing on salt, Gandhi focused on something universal, something that everyone understood to be essential. The salt monopoly became a lens through which all the injustices of colonial rule could be viewed. And when the monopoly was challenged, successfully, it demonstrated that colonial rule itself could be challenged and successfully resisted. Section 9. Portuguese Salt and the Atlantic Empire. While India was under British rule and struggling against the salt monopoly, another part of the world had a very different relationship with salt. Portugal, a small nation on the western edge of Europe, had built an empire partly on salt and the fish that salt could preserve. Portugal's relationship with salt dates back to ancient times. The Phoenicians and Carthaginians had harvested salt along the Portuguese coast. When the Romans controlled the region, they continued salt production. But it was in the medieval and early modern periods that Portuguese salt became particularly significant. Along the Algarve coast in southern Portugal and the coast near Setbal, there were extensive salt pans. These are shallow pools where seawater is allowed to evaporate naturally in the sun, leaving behind crystals of salt. Portuguese salt farmers developed sophisticated techniques for managing these pans, maximizing salt production, and managing quality. Portuguese salt became famous throughout Europe for its purity and quality. But the true revolution in Portuguese salt came with one of history's most important developments, the Age of Exploration and the opening of Atlantic Ocean routes. As Portuguese explorers began sailing farther into the Atlantic in the 15th century, they began to catch fish. Lots of fish. The Atlantic is extraordinarily rich in fish, particularly cod. Portuguese fishermen began making long voyages to fish the Atlantic, particularly to the waters off Newfoundland, though that land was not known to Europeans yet. Portuguese salt farmers and merchants realized that their salt could be used to preserve Atlantic fish. They could salt cod on the fishing vessels, in the holds, and the salt-preserved cod would keep for months, even years. This meant that fishing expeditions could be longer. More fish could be caught per voyage. The fish could be stored in bulk and sold gradually, rather than all at once. This created a symbiotic relationship. Portuguese salt was used to preserve Portuguese fish. The preserved fish could be traded throughout Europe and beyond. Salted cod became a major trade commodity. Portugal exported enormous quantities of salt, along with instructions on how to salt fish. The salt and salted fish trade became a cornerstone of the Portuguese economy. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Portuguese salt production increased dramatically to meet the demand from the expanding fishing industry. The salt pans of the Algarve and Setbal became among the busiest and most productive in Europe. Portugal became not just a fishing nation, but a salt-exporting nation. The relationship between Portugal and salt was so significant that it affected Portugal's military and diplomatic strategy. During World War II, Portugal maintained a significant salt export trade with various nations. Portugal's merchant fleet included ships known as the White Fleet because they were painted white to indicate neutral Portuguese vessels. These ships carried salt and salted fish throughout the Atlantic during the war. It is reasonable to infer that Portugal's ability to maintain its salt and fish trade during World War II, while remaining officially neutral, contributed to Portugal's survival and economic stability during that turbulent period. Salt, which had been part of Portugal's economy for thousands of years, remained strategically important even in the 20th century. The Portuguese experience with salt demonstrates something different from the monopolies and taxation systems of other nations. Rather than trolling shoal, porridge salt trade, they understood that salt production in Portuguese regions like the Algarve was a natural advantage. The climate was suitable, the expertise existed, and the demand was there. By allowing and encouraging salt production and trade, Portugal leveraged this advantage. The story of Portuguese salt also connects to broader themes of exploration and colonialism. As Portuguese ships ventured into the Atlantic and eventually around Africa to Asia, salt was often part of their cargo. Salt was a valuable trading good. It was relatively lightweight and could be preserved indefinitely, making it ideal for long ocean voyages. Portuguese merchants could trade salt for spices, silks, and other valuable goods in distant lands. In this way, salt enabled exploration. The abundance of salt allowed it to be used as ballast and trading commodity on ships that were exploring the world. Salt preserved the food that allowed sailors to survive long voyages. Salt in the ship's hold could be traded for valuable goods. This seems almost too ordinary to mention, yet without salt, the age of exploration might have taken a very different form. Section 10. Japan's Salt and the Shoyu Revolution. In Japan, salt followed a different path from Europe or Africa or China. While Chinese emperors maintained salt monopolies for their revenue value, and West African rulers used salt trade to build empires, Japan developed a unique relationship with salt centered on culinary tradition and artisanal production. The island of Shodoshima, located in Japan's Seto Inland Sea, became the center of Japanese salt production and culture. The exact dating of salt production on Shodoshima extends into ancient times, though the precise dates are difficult to establish. What we know is that by the medieval period, Shodoshima had become famous throughout Japan for salt production. The salt pans of Shodoshima operated on a seasonal basis. During the dry season, seawater would be gathered and evaporated in the sun. Workers would harvest the salt crystals and prepare them for use. The technique was similar to salt production elsewhere in the world, but the approach was different. Rather than being purely a commercial enterprise, salt production on Shodoshima was integrated into local culture and community. But the truly transformative development in Japanese salt history came with the development of shoyu soy sauce. The exact origins of shoyu are difficult to pinpoint, but it developed gradually in Japan, reaching more refined forms during the 16th and 17th centuries. Shoyu is made through a fermentation process involving soybeans, grain, usually wheat, salt, and special molds. The fermentation process takes months, sometimes years, and produces a complex flavor that is central to Japanese cuisine. Here is the crucial connection. Shoyu production requires significant quantities of salt. The salt is essential to the fermentation process. Without salt, the right bacteria and molds cannot flourish in the right way. The quality of the salt affects the quality of the shoyu. Based on what we know of shoyu production, we can infer that the development of shoyu production was intimately connected with the development of high-quality salt production. Shodoshima's salt became the salt of choice for shoyu producers throughout Japan. The salt from Shodoshima had particular properties that made it ideal for shoyu fermentation. Shoyu producers from other regions would purchase Shodoshima salt. This created sustained demand for Shodoshima salt, which drove the development of salt production on the island. By the 17th century, Shodoshima had become one of the most important producers of both salt and shoyu in Japan. The two industries were intertwined. The salt enabled the shoyu production. The shoyu production consumed the salt. Together, they created a prosperous regional economy. Over the centuries that followed, Shodoshima maintained its position as a major salt and shoyu production center. The shoyu industry, built on salt, became central to Japanese cuisine and therefore to Japanese culture. Shoyu appeared in nearly every Japanese meal. Its complex, savory flavor defined Japanese food. And at the foundation of shoyu was salt that allowed the fermentation to proceed. Salt that preserved the ingredients. Salt that gave shoyu its characteristic flavor. This represents a different model from the Chinese salt monopoly or the Portuguese salt trade empire. In Japan, salt became woven into culinary tradition. Salt was not primarily a commodity to be taxed or traded for profit, though there were certainly economic dimensions. Salt was a necessity for producing the foods that defined Japanese culture. Regional salt production in Japan also maintained distinct characteristics. Salt from different regions, produced through different methods, had different properties and flavors. This created a kind of salt culture in Japan, where different salts were prized for different purposes. Some salt was particularly valued for shoyu production. Other salt was valued for food preservation. Some salt was valued for its flavor. By the 19th and 20th centuries, as industrialization transformed Japan and the world, Shoroshima's role in salt and shoyu production remained significant. Modern techniques were adopted, but traditional methods persisted alongside them. To this day, Shoroshima is known for its salt and for its role in shoyu production. The island has become a cultural heritage site, with artisanal salt producers maintaining traditional methods. The Japanese experience with salt reveals how salt could be integrated into culture in ways that went beyond mere economics or politics. Salt, in Japan, became part of what it meant to be Japanese, inseparable from Japanese food and Japanese tradition. This is a different kind of salt story from the empires and monopolies and revolutions we have seen elsewhere. It is a story of how a basic mineral could become woven into the everyday practices and cultural identity of a people. Section 10. Japan's Salt and the Shoyu Revolution. In Japan, salt followed a different path from Europe or Africa or China. While Chinese emperors maintained salt monopolies for their revenue value, and West African rulers used salt trade to build empires, Japan developed a unique relationship with salt centered on culinary tradition and artisanal production. The island of Shoroshima, located in Japan's Seto Inland Sea, became the center of Japanese salt production and culture. The exact dating of salt production on Shoroshima extends into ancient times, though the precise dates are difficult to establish. What we know is that by the medieval period, Shoroshima had become famous throughout Japan for salt production. The salt pans of Shoroshima operated on a seasonal basis. During the dry season, seawater would be gathered and evaporated in the sun. Workers would harvest the salt crystals and prepare them for use. The technique was similar to salt production elsewhere in the world, but the approach was different. Rather than being purely a commercial enterprise, salt production on Shoroshima was integrated into local culture and community. But the truly transformative development in Japanese salt history came with the development of shoyu soy sauce. The exact origins of shoyu are difficult to pinpoint, but it developed gradually in Japan, reaching more refined forms during the 16th and 17th centuries. Shoyu is made through a fermentation process involving soybeans, grain, usually wheat, salt, and special molds. The fermentation process takes months, sometimes years, and produces a complex flavor that is central to Japanese cuisine. Here is the crucial connection. Shoyu production requires significant quantities of salt. The salt is essential to the fermentation process. Without salt, the right bacteria and molds cannot flourish in the right way. The quality of the salt affects the quality of the shoyu. Based on what we know of shoyu production, we can infer that the development of shoyu production was intimately connected with the development of high-quality salt production. Shoroshima's salt became the salt of choice for shoyu producers throughout Japan. The salt from Shoroshima had particular properties that made it ideal for shoyu fermentation. Shoyu producers from other regions would purchase Shoroshima salt. This created sustained demand for Shoroshima salt, which drove the development of salt production on the island. By the 17th century, Shoroshima had become one of the most important producers of both salt and shoyu in Japan. The two industries were intertwined. The salt enabled the shoyu production. The shoyu production consumed the salt. Together, they created a prosperous regional economy. Over the centuries that followed, Shotoshima maintained its position as a major salt and shoyu production center. The shoyu industry, built on salt, became central to Japanese cuisine and therefore to Japanese culture. Shoyu appeared in nearly every Japanese meal. Its complex, savory flavor defined Japanese food. And at the foundation of shoyu was salt that allowed the fermentation to proceed. Salt that preserved the ingredients. Salt that gave shoyu its characteristic flavor. This represents a different model from the Chinese salt monopoly or the Portuguese salt trade empire. In Japan, salt became woven into culinary tradition. Salt was not primarily a commodity to be taxed or traded for profit, though there were certainly economic dimensions. Salt was a necessity for producing the foods that defined Japanese culture. Regional salt production in Japan also maintained distinct characteristics. Salt from different regions, produced through different methods, had different properties and flavors. This created a kind of salt culture in Japan, where different salts were prized for different purposes. Some salt was particularly valued for shoyu production. Other salt was valued for food preservation. Some salt was valued for its flavor. By the 19th and 20th centuries, as industrialization transformed Japan and the world, Shotoshima's role in salt and shoyu production remained significant. Modern techniques were adopted, but traditional methods persisted alongside them. To this day, Shotoshima is known for its salt and for its role in shoyu production. The island has become a cultural heritage site, with artisanal salt producers maintaining traditional methods. The Japanese experience with salt reveals how salt could be integrated into culture in ways that went beyond mere economics or politics. Salt, in Japan, became part of what it meant to be Japanese, inseparable from Japanese food and Japanese tradition. This is a different kind of salt story from the empires and monopolies and revolutions we have seen elsewhere. It is a story of how a basic mineral could become woven into the everyday practices and cultural identity of a people. The role of salt in enabling food preservation deserves deeper examination, because it is perhaps salt's most profound contribution to human civilization. Before salt preservation became widespread, humanity faced a fundamental constraint: the seasons. In spring and summer and early fall, food was abundant. The land was fertile. Plants grew. Animals could be hunted. But then came winter. The land became barren. Snow covered the ground. There were no fresh plants. Animals were scarce. Winter meant hunger. It meant malnutrition. It meant death, for some. Every culture that lived in seasonal climates faced this same problem. The solution that emerged, independently in many cultures, was preservation. Food from times of abundance could be preserved and saved for times of scarcity. The methods varied: smoking, drying, fermenting. But salt was among the most effective and most widely used methods. Salted meat could be kept for months. Salted fish could be kept for years. Salted vegetables could sustain a population through winter. This changed everything. It meant that seasonal scarcity became manageable. A community did not need to have enough food available every day of winter. They needed to have enough preserved food to last the winter. This was a fundamentally different problem, and one that was manageable. The agricultural revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, depended partly on this. Farmers could accept the risk of farming the hard work, the investment in seeds and tools, the uncertainty of harvest, because they could preserve surplus harvests. Salt preservation meant that a good harvest could be stored and consumed gradually over months or even years. This made farming economically viable. As farming became established and populations began to settle in agricultural communities, the reliance on salt preservation increased. Agricultural communities needed salt to preserve their crops and their livestock products. Communities near salt sources had advantages over communities far from salt sources. This created trade. Communities without salt access had to trade for it. Communities with salt access could trade it for other goods. This trade in salt was among the first regular, long-distance trade. Before the silk trade, before the spice trade, before the precious metals trade, there was salt trade. Salt was among the first goods that motivated merchants to travel long distances and establish regular trading relationships. The development of trade created the need for merchants. The need for merchants created the need for safe routes. The need for safe routes created the need for governance that could maintain order and protect trade. The need for governance created the need for centralized authority. This chain of consequences, starting with salt preservation and trade, led to the development of organized states and empires. In this way, salt was not merely an economic commodity. Salt was one of the foundational technologies upon which complex civilization was built. Without salt, or with much more limited access to salt, the entire trajectory of human civilization might have been different. Different regions of the world, having different relationships with salt sources, developed different patterns of civilization. In regions with abundant salt, like coastal regions and inland salt basins, civilization could develop with more security in food supply. In regions without easy access to salt, development was more constrained unless trade routes could be established. The geography of salt deposits thus became a kind of geography of human potential. The Nile Delta with its salt lakes could support the development of a great civilization. The coasts of China, with seawater for evaporation, could support large populations. The Sahara, with its salt mines in the midst of the desert, became a center of trade. The Mediterranean, with its seawater and its salt marshes, became a center of commerce and culture. And the regions far from salt sources had to either establish trade relationships to obtain salt or remain less densely populated and less complex in their social organization. It is one of the remarkable aspects of human history that so much of the geography of civilization can be understood by examining salt. The presence of salt sources, the difficulty of transporting salt across distances, the value of salt in preservation, and in trade, these factors shaped where people lived, how they lived, and what forms of organization they developed. Section 11. Salt Empires and Economic Foundations. Throughout history, empires have understood a simple principle: whoever controls salt controls wealth. We have seen this principle demonstrated again and again. Egypt built much of its wealth and power through natron. Rome used salt monopolies and salt trade as part of its imperial strategy. China maintained salt monopoly for over 2,000 years, specifically because of the enormous revenue it generated. France taxed salt so heavily that the taxation became a symbol of royal oppression. West African empires built their power on trans-Saharan salt and gold trade. This pattern reveals something important about how pre-modern states generated revenue. In the modern world, governments derive revenue from many sources: income taxes, sales taxes, corporate taxes, property taxes, inheritance taxes, and more. But in the pre-modern world, the sources of government revenue were much more limited. Agriculture could be taxed, but this was often difficult and contentious. Trade could be taxed, but merchants could often evade taxes. Minerals and resources, if they could be monopolized or heavily taxed, became attractive sources of revenue. Salt was the ideal mineral for this purpose. It was essential, everyone needed it. It was producible in limited locations, this made monopoly possible. It was valuable relative to its weight, this made it worth trading and taxing. And it was relatively easy to control. It had to be produced in specific locations and could not be easily hidden or smuggled, though smuggling did occur. From the perspective of a ruler, salt taxation or salt monopoly was an almost perfect tax. It was reliable revenue. It did not require the ruler to convince or persuade people to buy salt. They would buy it anyway, at any reasonable price. It was relatively easy to collect. The state just had to control the production and distribution. And it could generate enormous revenue. This is why salt taxation was so attractive to so many rulers throughout history. It seems almost too simple: control the salt, and you control wealth. But in practice, it was effective. Empires rose on the foundation of salt revenue. Governments paid for armies, infrastructure, and administration partly with salt money. The broader principle here is about the relationship between natural resources and political power. Those who control a crucial natural resource that others need have power over those others. This is true of salt. It is also true of other resources: oil in modern times, metals, agricultural land, water. Throughout history, control of crucial resources has been a source of political power. But salt was unique in one respect. It was so universal, so essential, so basic to human survival and society, that almost every civilization that encountered it recognized its importance. There was no civilization that discovered salt and then ignored it or failed to attempt to control or tax it. Salt was recognized as important everywhere, immediately. This universality of recognition is striking. Based on what we know of human nature and economics, we can infer that this universality reflects genuine understanding by rulers and societies of salt's fundamental importance. It was not based on superstition or accident. It was based on a real understanding that salt was essential, and that this essentiality could be leveraged into political and economic power. Section 12. The modern era salt in the contemporary world. The world changed dramatically in the 19th and 20th centuries. Industrialization transformed how food was produced and preserved. Refrigeration, canning, and other technologies provided alternatives to salt preservation. The rise of modern income taxes and other forms of taxation meant that governments no longer relied as heavily on salt taxation. The colonial empires that had maintained salt monopolies began to collapse or to modernize. And yet salt remained important. Indeed, in many ways, salt became more important than ever, even as its role changed. In the industrial world, salt found new uses. The chloralkali process, which uses salt to produce chlorine and sodium hydroxide, became crucial to chemical manufacturing. These chemicals are used in the production of plastics, pharmaceuticals, pesticides, and countless other industrial products. Modern industrial chemistry is built, in substantial part, on salt. De-icing salt became important in northern regions, where winter snow and ice made roads treacherous. Cities and states began to apply salt to roads to melt ice and improve traction. This was not a new use. Salt had been used on ice before, but the industrial scale of it was new. Modern industrial societies use enormous quantities of salt for de-icing. Water treatment plants use salt. The solar salt industry grew to tremendous scale as salt was used in industrial processes. Salt became a commodity traded globally, just as it had been traded regionally in earlier periods. Modern ports developed around salt terminals, where salt is loaded onto ships for export. At the same time, new understandings of salt emerged. In the 20th century, scientists began to understand that excessive salt consumption could contribute to high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. This led to public health campaigns urging people to reduce salt consumption. In many developed countries, dietary salt became controversial. Some health advocates urged dramatic reductions in salt intake. This is notable because it represents one of the few times in human history when salt has been viewed as something to be avoided rather than embraced. For most of history, salt was precious and desired. Food was salted heavily, partly because salt was expensive and demonstrated wealth and status. But in modern times, excess salt became viewed as a health problem. Despite this health concern, salt remains essential. The human body requires salt. The question is not whether to consume salt, but how much. And the answer to that question remains debated by nutritionists and health experts. Culturally, salt persists in language and symbolism. We speak of someone being worth their salt to mean they are competent and valuable. We speak of the salt of the earth to refer to ordinary, good people. We speak of taking something with a grain of salt to mean not accepting it as completely true. These phrases, scattered throughout English and other languages, are vestiges of salt's historical importance. They reflect times when salt was precious, and its value was recognized in everyday language. In some regions of the world, traditional salt production methods persist. In the Mediterranean, in parts of Portugal and Spain, salt marshes are still worked by hand, using techniques that would be recognizable to medieval or ancient salt workers. In Japan, artisanal salt production continues on islands like Shoyu. In various parts of the world, traditional salt makers maintain their craft, even as industrial salt production has become the norm. The global salt market today is enormous. Hundreds of millions of tons of salt are produced annually. The majority of this salt is used in industrial processes, particularly the chlor-alkali process. De-icing salt represents a significant portion. Salt for food production represents a smaller but still significant portion. And salt for various other uses, water treatment, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, rounds out the total. The geography of salt production has changed, but has not been entirely revolutionized. Coastal regions still produce significant quantities of salt through evaporation. Mines in inland areas produce salt extracted from underground deposits. Some of the same regions that were important salt sources thousands of years ago remain important salt sources today. It is worth noting that the United States, which emerged as a major power in the 20th century, does not depend heavily on salt taxation or salt monopoly. The United States has relied on other forms of taxation. But this does not mean salt is unimportant to America. American industry uses vast quantities of salt. American roads are de-iced with salt. American food production depends partly on salt preservation and salt use in food processing. Salt in the Americas, a forgotten history. While we have examined salt's role in Egypt, Rome, China, West Africa, and Europe, there is one significant portion of human history we have not yet explored: the role of salt in the Americas. The civilizations that developed in North America, Central America, and South America had their own complex relationships with salt, and these relationships shaped their development in profound ways. The Aztec Empire, one of the greatest civilizations of pre-Columbian America, flourished in what is now Mexico from roughly 1345 to 1521 CE. The Aztecs, like all other civilizations, recognized the value of salt. But the geography of their empire created a unique situation. The Aztec heartland was built around Lake Texcoco, a body of water in the Valley of Mexico that was brackish, containing salt water mixed with fresh water. The Aztecs developed sophisticated methods for harvesting salt from Lake Texcoco. They would evaporate the water from the lake to collect salt crystals. They also preserved fish from the lake using salt. Beyond food preservation, salt became part of Aztec tribute systems. Conquered peoples and tributary states were required to pay tribute to the Aztec Empire, and salt was one of the commodities included in these tribute payments. This suggests that the Aztec rulers recognized salt's value and sought to control it as a source of wealth and power. Based on what we know of Aztec economic systems, we can infer that salt taxation and salt tribute contributed meaningfully to Aztec imperial revenue, much as salt monopolies did in other parts of the world. The Aztecs maintained what historians call a tribute empire, where conquered regions paid tributes to the center. Salt, being a necessary commodity with inelastic demand, was an ideal tribute item. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, built on an island in Lake Texcoco, grew to be one of the largest cities in the world at that time, with perhaps 200,000 to 400,000 inhabitants. The city's ability to maintain such a large population depended on reliable food supplies. Salt played a role in food preservation and in the trade networks that brought food to the city. The preserved fish from the lake, salted and stored, provided protein for the population. In South America, the Inca Empire, which flourished from roughly 1438 to 1533 CE, also had a complex relationship with salt. The Inca territory, stretching from modern-day Colombia down through Peru and into Chile and Argentina, included regions with natural salt deposits and salt springs. One particularly famous site was the salt mine at Maras in Peru, which contained hundreds of salt ponds fed by natural brine springs. The Incas, like the Aztecs, recognized salt's value and incorporated it into their economic and administrative systems. Salt from mares and other sources was used for food preservation, for trade, and as a commodity of value within the Inca economy. It is reasonable to infer that salt contributed to the Inca economy and to the functioning of their administrative system. The Inca salt mines at Mares are particularly interesting because they have persisted to the present day. In modern times, local communities still harvest salt from these same ponds using methods that are not dramatically different from Inca-era techniques. This represents one of the longest continuous uses of a specific salt site in human history. Salt has been harvested from maras for at least 500 years, possibly much longer. In North America, the indigenous peoples of what is now the United States and Canada also worked with salt. Coastal peoples harvested sea salt. Inland peoples in regions with salt springs or salt deposits harvested salt from those sources. Archaeological evidence suggests that salt trade networks existed in North America, with salt being traded from regions where it was abundant to regions where it was scarce. One particularly important salt region in North America was the Great Salt Lake region in what is now Utah, and the salt marshes along the Pacific coast in California. Indigenous peoples in these regions harvested salt and traded it with other groups. The trade networks organized around salt would have facilitated the exchange of other goods as well, creating economic connections across regions. The importance of salt in pre-Columbian America is often overlooked in historical accounts, which tend to focus on gold and silver as the primary resources and trade goods. But based on what we know of how other civilizations used salt, it is reasonable to infer that salt played a significant economic and social role in American civilizations as well. Salt was not as dramatically valuable or as symbolically important as gold and silver, which could be crafted into prestige goods and religious objects. But salt was more fundamental to survival and to food security. The importance of salt in pre-Columbian America is often overlooked in historical accounts, which tend to focus on gold and silver as the primary resources and trade goods. But based on what we know of how other civilizations used salt, it is reasonable to infer that salt played a significant economic and social role in American civilizations as well. Salt was not as dramatically valuable or as symbolically important as gold and silver, which could be crafted into prestige goods and religious objects. But salt was more fundamental to survival and to food security. When Europeans arrived in the Americas in 1492 and after, they encountered salt-using cultures with their own salt production and trade systems. One of the ways that European colonization disrupted indigenous societies was by disrupting these salt systems. Spanish conquistadors and their successors took control of salt sources. They sometimes restricted indigenous access to salt, using salt control as a tool of colonial domination, much as the British later would in India. In some regions of colonial America, salt became a point of contestation. During the American Revolution, British control of salt supplies became a point of grievance, contributing to revolutionary sentiment. After American independence, salt continued to be important. The young United States recognized salt's value and sought to protect its salt industry. American salt ponds along the Atlantic coast became a focus of economic development. During the 19th century, as the United States industrialized, American salt production increased dramatically. Michigan, with its extensive underground salt deposits, became a major salt producer. Ohio and other states also developed significant salt industries. American salt became a commodity in global trade. American salt supplied industries, de-iced roads, and preserved food. The discovery and exploitation of massive underground salt deposits in North America during the 19th century changed the geography of global salt production. Previously, salt production had been concentrated in coastal regions, where seawater could be evaporated. With the discovery of vast underground deposits, inland regions suddenly became capable of large-scale salt production. This shifted some of the economic advantages of salt production away from coastal regions. In Latin America, as Spanish and Portuguese colonies developed, salt also became important to colonial economies. Salt was used for meat preservation, creating salted meat products that could be traded. In regions like Argentina, which developed a significant beef industry, salt played a crucial role in preserving and trading meat. Salted beef, known as shark in Spanish, which evolved into the English word jerky, became a major trade commodity. The salt trade in colonial and early modern Americas was less dramatic than the gold and silver trade, but it was often more fundamental to everyday life and survival. While gold and silver could only be used by the wealthy and powerful, salt was used by everyone. While gold and silver trade enriched merchants and rulers, salt was essential to the food security of entire populations. It is worth noting that salt played a role in the development of American cuisine. Many traditional American foods, from smoked and salted meats to pickled vegetables, depend on salt. The preservation methods that were developed in America, often adapting techniques from Europe, Africa, and indigenous sources, relied on salt. American food culture was, in part, shaped by salt, and by the need to preserve food in a land with long, cold winters in the north, and demanding climates in various regions. The story of salt in the Americas is less visible in historical accounts than the stories of salt in Eurasia and Africa, but it is real and significant. American civilizations recognized salt's value. They organized production and trade around salt. They used salt to preserve food and to build economic systems. When Europeans arrived, they found these salt systems already in place, and they sought to control them. The disruption of indigenous salt systems, while less famous than the disruption of gold mining or land ownership, was real and had consequences. The inclusion of the Americas in this history of salt reminds us of an important principle. Salt was not only important in Eurasia and Africa, it was important everywhere that humans lived. The specific forms of salt use varied. The emphasis on particular uses varied, but the fundamental reality was universal. Human civilizations, wherever they developed, had to solve the problem of food preservation and food security. And in the Americas, as in every other inhabited region of the world, salt was part of the solution. Section 13, The Secret Life of Salt Revealed. We have now traveled through the history of salt from ancient Egypt to the modern era. We have examined how salt-shaped empires sparked revolutions, fed armies, enabled trade, and built civilizations. We have seen how salt was controlled by rulers, fought over by merchants, and desired by common people. What is the secret life of salt that the title of this narrative promises to reveal? The secret is this: salt is not merely a mineral. It is a technology. It is an economic system. It is a tool of power. It is a necessity of life. It is all of these things at once. And understanding salt means understanding these dimensions of human civilization. Salt is a technology because it solves a fundamental problem: how to preserve food and extend it across time and space. This technology enabled food to be stored, traded, and transported. It made possible the development of cities, armies, and empires that were removed from immediate food production. Salt is an economic system because its production, distribution, and consumption structure entire economies. Regions with salt sources become wealthy. Trade routes develop around salt transport. Merchants specialize in salt trade. Revenue systems develop around salt taxation. Entire patterns of economic organization emerge from salt. Salt is a tool of power because whoever controls salt can extract wealth and exercise authority. Kings used salt monopolies to fund their kingdoms. Emperors maintained salt control to preserve their power. Rulers taxed salt because it was reliable revenue. And rebels challenged salt monopolies as a way to challenge authority. Salt is a necessity of life because human bodies require salt and human food requires salt preservation. This necessity makes salt inelastic in demand. People will pay for salt. They will not simply choose to forgo it. This inelasticity makes salt an ideal target for taxation and an ideal commodity for monopoly. Understanding salt, then, means understanding something fundamental about how human societies organize themselves. Societies need to solve the problem of food preservation. Societies need to generate revenue. Societies need to maintain order and authority. Salt addresses all of these needs. This is why salt appears in every civilization we have examined. The specific details differ. The salt sources are different. The political systems are different. The trade routes are different. But the underlying reality is the same. Salt is central to how societies function. Kenti, the ancient Egyptian salt worker with whom this narrative began, did not understand all of this in any systematic way. He knew that he was gathering salt, that it was valuable, that his family depended on his labor. He did not know that he was participating in the construction of civilization itself. He did not know that the salt he gathered would preserve food that would feed armies that would build empires. He did not know that the simplicity of salt would create complexities of empire, trade, and politics that would persist for thousands of years. But in his action gathering salt, preserving food, enabling survival, Kenti was engaged in one of the most fundamental human activities. He was solving the problem of time. He was taking abundance in the present and making it available in the future. He was making it possible for societies to imagine a future different from the present moment. This is the secret life of salt. It is the mineral of time itself. Salt takes the present and extends it into the future. It preserves what would otherwise perish. It stores what would otherwise be lost. In doing so, it makes possible the accumulation of resources, the development of surplus, the emergence of civilization itself. Every great civilization in human history has had to solve the problem that salt solves. Every ruler who sought power had to deal with salt in some way. Every person who sought food security had to seek salt. The universality of this pattern reveals something profound. We are salt-dependent creatures building salt-dependent civilizations. The future of salt remains to be written. In an age of industrial agriculture, refrigeration, and modern preservation techniques, salt's role has changed. But salt has not disappeared. It persists in industry, in food, in chemistry, in de-icing, in countless applications. And the fundamental reality remains: salt is necessary. Some environmental concerns have emerged around salt production and use. Salt mining can affect water systems. De-icing salt can damage roads and harm aquatic ecosystems. Large-scale salt production can impact local environments. These concerns are real and worth addressing. At the same time, salt remains essential. Industry depends on salt. Food production depends on salt. Modern life depends on salt in ways both obvious and subtle. The challenge for the future is not to eliminate salt or salt use, but to use salt sustainably and responsibly. The history of salt teaches us that basic resources that seem ordinary and simple can be profound. Water seems simple, yet it is essential. Soil seems simple, yet it is the foundation of agriculture. Salt seems simple, yet it has shaped civilizations. When we examine the history of salt, we are examining the history of human civilization itself. We are examining how humans have solved fundamental problems. We are examining how power works. We are examining how trade functions. We are examining how societies organize themselves. Kenti stood in the salt marshes of ancient Egypt and gathered crystals. Today, billions of people stand in a world built, in part, on the salt that people like Kenti gathered. We eat food preserved with salt. We drive on roads de-iced with salt. We use products made from salt-based chemicals. We live in cities that developed partly because salt could be traded. We are governed by systems that, at various points in history, derived significant revenue from salt. The secret life of salt is not really secret at all. It is hidden in plain sight, in every meal we eat, in every road we drive on, in every industrial chemical we depend on. It is the story of human civilization told through the history of one humble mineral. This is why the story of salt matters. It is not the story of a rare or exotic substance. It is the story of the ordinary made extraordinary. It is the story of how something simple, salt from the earth, became woven through every dimension of human society. It is the story of how a basic need, the need to preserve food, transformed into systems of power, trade, and civilization. Understanding salt, then, is understanding ourselves. It is understanding how we have solved fundamental problems. It is understanding how we have organized ourselves into societies. It is understanding the deep history that underlies the modern world. From the ancient Nile to medieval France, from the Sahara to imperial China, from Portuguese fishing fleets to Indian independence movements, from Japanese kitchens to modern chemistry labs, salt has been present. Not always visible, not always central in the way we tell history, but consistently present, consistently important. The next time you taste salt, you are tasting thousands of years of history. You are tasting the labor of countless salt workers across the centuries. You are tasting the basis of empires and the foundation of civilizations. You are tasting the simple mineral that made human civilization possible. This is the secret life of salt. It is profound. It is universal, and it is hidden in plain sight. It is the story of how the ordinary becomes the foundation of everything.